There's a road in Canada's north, a road so quiet, so endless, that at night it feels like the forest itself is watching. For decades, travelers have vanished here. Women disappear without a trace, as if swallowed by the mist. Some blame killers who walk unseen. Others whisper of curses, of spirits bound to the highway. What is the truth of this place? A crime scene? A curse? Or a mystery so vast that even now, no one dares to claim the answers? This is the story of the Highway of Tears, where fact and fear collide. And the road keeps its secrets. There are places in the world where the land itself feels heavy with secrets, where every bend in the road, every shadow between the trees, carries a silence that lingers and unsettles. One such place lies in the northern wilderness of British Columbia, Canada, a place that has become infamous, a place now known by a name that chills the spine: the Highway of Tears. Stretching nearly 450 miles, Highway 16 carves its way through dense forests, small logging towns, and endless wilderness. It is a road that connects, but it is also a road that divides. On one side, the promise of travel, opportunity, and freedom. On the other, fear, grief, and unanswered questions that span generations. For decades, this highway has carried more than traffic. It has carried the weight of disappearances, women, mostly young, many indigenous, who vanished along this road, some never seen again. For their families, each mile of this highway is not just asphalt and gravel. It is memory, pain, and mystery. But before we enter the stories of those women, we must first understand the highway itself. Because the road is more than just a backdrop. In many ways, it is a character in this story. Highway 16 winds through some of the most beautiful and dangerous landscapes in North America. Towering evergreens line the road. Rivers snake through valleys. In winter, the snow falls heavy, blinding, and endless. In summer, the air is still, the silence broken only by the cry of a raven or the hum of a truck engine far in the distance. This is isolation. Miles and miles where towns are few and people are fewer. For a young woman walking alone or hitchhiking, it can feel like being swallowed whole by the wilderness. And it is this isolation that predators have exploited, turning the highway into a hunting ground. The story begins decades ago, in the 1960s and 70s, when women first started vanishing along this road. At first, each disappearance seemed isolated. A runaway, an accident, a tragedy that happened far from the eyes of the world. But slowly, patterns emerged. And with each passing year, the whispers grew louder. Families began to notice what authorities did not, or would not. That women were disappearing along the same highway. That indigenous families were crying out for help. That the road itself was swallowing daughters, sisters, and mothers, leaving only silence behind. She said she was just going to visit a friend. She never came home. They told us maybe she ran away. But I knew something had happened to her out there on that road. By the early 1990s, the grief had spread so wide. The road itself was given a name by those who carry the pain, the Highway of Tears. A name born from vigils, protests, and the cries of families who felt abandoned by those sworn to protect them. It is a name that still echoes today, a name that is both a warning and a remembrance. But why has this road, more than others, become such a dark corridor? Some point to poverty, to the lack of public transportation that forces people, especially young women, to hitchhike. Others point to the remoteness, the ease with which predators can act unseen. And some whisper that it is more than circumstance, that the road itself has become cursed, a place where evil lingers in the shadows. Over the next several parts of this story, we will walk this road together. We will meet the women who vanished, their names, their faces, their lives. We will listen to the families who never stopped searching. We will explore theories, lone killers, drifting predators, human trafficking, and failures of justice. But for now, as we stand at the beginning of this journey, remember this. Highway 16 is more than a stretch of road. It is a place where silence weighs heavy, where shadows seem to stretch longer than the daylight, and where mysteries wait in the darkness. This is the beginning of our journey into the Highway of Tears, a journey into grief, silence, and secrets that the land itself seems to guard. There's a stretch of road in British Columbia, Canada, where silence speaks louder than words. A road that winds through endless forests, mountains, and rivers. To travelers, it may seem like just another highway. But to the families who've lost daughters, sisters, and mothers along its path, it is known by a different name. The Highway of Tears. For decades, women have vanished along this lonely stretch of Highway 16. Some are last seen hitchhiking. Others simply disappeared without a trace. Their stories left behind whispers, grief, and questions that have never been answered. But why here? Why this road? The Highway of Tears is not just a place on a map. It's a wound that refuses to heal. It's a chilling mystery that sits at the crossroads of true crime and haunting legend. Some say the danger lies in the isolation. Others believe predators were hunting freely, taking advantage of a system that failed to protect the vulnerable. And then, there are those who feel something else in the air here. A presence. A darkness that lingers in the shadows of the pines, watching as the miles pass. In this journey, we will step onto that road. We will meet the women who never came home and the families who still wait for answers. We will explore the theories, the truths, and the mysteries that have turned Highway 16 into one of the most haunted roads in North America. There are places in the world where the land itself feels heavy with secrets, where every bend in the road, every shadow between the trees, carries a silence that lingers and unsettles. One such place lies in the northern wilderness of British Columbia, Canada, a place that has become infamous, a place now known by a name that chills the spine. Stretching nearly 450 miles, Highway 16 carves its way through dense forests, small logging towns, and endless wilderness. It is a road that connects, but it is also a road that divides. On one side, the promise of travel, opportunity, and freedom. On the other, fear, grief, and unanswered questions that span generations. For decades, this highway has carried more than traffic. It has carried the weight of disappearances, women, mostly young, many indigenous, who vanished along this road, some never seen again. For their families, each mile of this highway is not just asphalt and gravel. It is memory, pain, and mystery. But before we enter the stories of those women, we must first understand the highway itself, because the road is more than just a backdrop. In many ways, it is a character in this story. Highway 16 winds through some of the most beautiful and dangerous landscapes in North America. Towering evergreens line the road. Rivers snake through valleys. In winter, the snow falls heavy, blinding, and endless. In summer, the air is still, the silence broken only by the cry of a raven or the hum of a truck engine far in the distance. This is isolation. Miles and miles where towns are few and people are fewer. For a young woman walking alone or hitchhiking, it can feel like being swallowed whole by the wilderness. And it is this isolation that predators have exploited, turning the highway into a hunting ground. The story begins decades ago, in the 1960s and 70s, when women first started vanishing along this road. At first, each disappearance seemed isolated. A runaway, an accident, a tragedy that happened far from the eyes of the world. But slowly, patterns emerged. And with each passing year, the whispers grew louder. Families began to notice what authorities did not, or would not, that women were disappearing along the same highway, that indigenous families were crying out for help, that the road itself was swallowing daughters, sisters, and mothers, leaving only silence behind. She said she was just going to visit a friend. She never came home. They told us maybe she ran away. But I knew something had happened to her out there on that road. By the early 1990s, the grief had spread so wide, the road itself was given a name by those who carry the pain, the Highway of Tears, a name born from vigils, protests, and the cries of families who felt abandoned by those sworn to protect them. It is a name that still echoes today, a name that is both a warning and a remembrance. But why has this road, more than others, become such a dark corridor? Some point to poverty, to the lack of public transportation that forces people, especially young women, to hitchhike. Others point to the remoteness, the ease with which predators can act unseen. And some whisper that it is more than circumstance, that the road itself has become cursed, a place where evil lingers in the shadows. Over the next several parts of this story, we will walk this road together. We will meet the women who vanished, their names, their faces, their lives. We will listen to the families who never stopped searching. We will explore theories, lone killers, drifting predators, human trafficking, and failures of justice. But for now, as we stand at the beginning of this journey, remember this. Highway 16 is more than a stretch of road. It is a place where silence weighs heavy, where shadows seem to stretch longer than the daylight, and where mysteries wait in the darkness. This is the beginning of our journey into the Highway of Tears, a journey into grief, silence, and secrets that the land itself seems to guard. To understand the mystery of the Highway of Tears, we must first understand the land it cuts through. This is not just a road. It is a landscape that defines lives, communities, and stories. A land of silence and shadows. British Columbia's north is a place of breathtaking beauty. Towering mountains rise against the horizon. Ancient forests stretch for miles, untouched and untamed. Rivers run cold and fast, carrying stories as old as time. But beauty here walks hand in hand with danger. The remoteness of this land is both its gift and its curse. For those who live here, it is home. For those who travel through, it can feel endless, isolating, even unforgiving. Highway 16 stretches for hundreds of miles, linking small towns, indigenous communities, and logging camps. Gas stations are few and far between. Cell phone service vanishes for long stretches. At night, the road can fall into a darkness so complete the stars are the only light. If your car breaks down here, if you're walking alone, there is no one to hear you, no one to see you, only the endless silence of the land. And it is in that silence that people disappear. For centuries, indigenous peoples have called this land home. First Nations communities are scattered across northern British Columbia, each with their own traditions, histories, and resilience. But there are also communities that have carried disproportionate pain. Many of the women who vanished along the Highway of Tears came from these very communities. Daughters, sisters, mothers. Many were young, some still in school, many facing the challenges of poverty and isolation. For them, Highway 16 was not just a road. It was a lifeline to reach school, to visit friends, to find work, or simply to get from one place to another. But without reliable transportation, many had no choice but to hitchhike. A dangerous decision, a necessary one, and for some, their last. In these early years, when the first disappearances began to surface, families say their pleas for help went unheard. Police dismissed some cases as runaways, others as accidents. For indigenous families, it felt like their daughters' lives mattered less. And so, as the silence of the land deepened, it was joined by another silence, the silence of institutions, a silence that cut even deeper than the wilderness. The land has always carried stories. Elders tell tales of spirits that walk the rivers and forests, stories of those who disappeared long before the highway was built. For some, these new vanishings are not just crimes. They are part of a larger shadow. Whether you believe in spirits, fate, or human cruelty, one truth remains. On this land, stories vanish. Women vanish, and answers vanish with them. But silence cannot last forever. Each missing woman has a name, a face, a story, and their families have carried those stories forward, demanding that they be heard. In the next part of this journey, we will meet them. We will say their names. We will learn who they were before the darkness of the highway swallowed them. Because behind every statistic, there's a daughter, a sister, a mother, and their stories are what bring light into this land of silence. Behind every mystery, there's a person. Behind every headline, a life. The Highway of Tears is not just a story of statistics or crime scenes or theories. It is a story of women, each with dreams, families, laughter, and love. In this chapter, we honor them. We say their names. We remember their faces. Because only by knowing who they were can we understand the weight of what was lost. The first known case often tied to the Highway of Tears is that of Gloria Moody, a 26-year-old Indigenous mother of two. In October 1969, Gloria was last seen leaving a bar in Williams Lake. The next day, her body was discovered in the woods nearby. Her death marked the beginning of a pattern, a tragedy that would echo down the decades. Not long after, more names would be added to the growing list. Micheline Pear, last seen hitchhiking near Hudson's Hope in 1970. Her body was never found. Gail Ways and Pamela Darlington both vanished in 1973, their disappearances linked years later to a suspected serial predator. One by one, their stories began to vanish into the silence of the highway. Many of the women who disappeared were heartbreakingly young. Monica Jack was only 12 years old when she was last seen riding her bike near Nicola Lake in 1978. Her remains were not discovered until nearly 2 decades later. 12 years old, a child stolen from her family, her community, her future. Then there was Colleen Macmillan, just 16, last seen in 1974. For decades, her case remained unsolved until DNA evidence in 2012 finally linked her murder to a known killer. But for almost 40 years, her family lived with silence. These were not faceless victims. They were daughters, students, dreamers. And the road took them too soon. Through the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, the list of names tied to the Highway of Tears grew. Ramona Wilson, 16, last seen hitchhiking in 1994. Alberta Williams, 24, disappeared in 1989, her body later found near Prince Rupert. Nicole Hoare, a young tree planter from Alberta, vanished in 2002, one of the few non-Indigenous women linked to the highway cases. Each new disappearance deepened the pain, widened the shadow, and raised the same haunting question: why was no one stopping this? They told me she probably ran away, but she never ran from her family. She was happy. She had plans. I knew something was wrong the moment she didn't come home. It's been 20 years. 20 years and still no answers. Every day I wake up and wonder if today will be the day we hear the truth. And every night I go to sleep with nothing. For these families, time does not heal. It only sharpens the wound. Each missing woman is not just a face on a poster. She is an empty seat at the table, a silence in the home, a memory that lives on only in photographs and in the voices of those who love them. Officially, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police acknowledge around 18 cases directly tied to the Highway of Tears. But advocacy groups and Indigenous organizations believe the number is much higher. Some say more than 40, others closer to 80. The truth may never be fully known. But behind each number, there is a name. Behind each name, a life. Gloria, Micheline, Gail, Pamela, Colleen, Monica, Ramona, Alberta, Nicole, and so many more. These are the faces of the missing. In the next chapter, we will trace the web of grief that links these stories together. We will meet the families who refuse to stay silent, the communities who keep searching, and the patterns that tie these tragedies to one another. Because the Highway of Tears is not just about what was lost. It is about the voices who demand that loss be remembered. Grief does not stay in one home. It spills into the streets, the schools, the towns. Each disappearance along the Highway of Tears did not just take a daughter, a sister, a mother. It took pieces of entire communities. And as the years passed, these losses began to connect, like threads woven into a tapestry of sorrow. This is the trail of pain the highway left behind. For the families of the missing, life became divided into two worlds, before the disappearance and after. Every ringing phone brought a surge of hope, maybe news, maybe a lead. Every knock at the door, a shiver of dread. Days turned into months, months into years. And still, the same silence echoed back. People tell you to move on. But how do you move on when you don't even know where she is? You wait. You wait every single day, because what if tomorrow is the day she comes home? In small communities along the highway, suspicion grew heavy. Everyone began to wonder, who could be responsible? Was it someone passing through, or someone closer to home? Mothers began warning their daughters not to hitchhike, but for many, there was no other way to travel. The road was both lifeline and predator, and fear became a constant companion. Parents drove extra miles to pick up children. Brothers walked sisters home. But even these precautions could not shield everyone. The disappearances continued, and so did the fear. Across indigenous communities, ceremonies of grief were held again and again. Elders prayed. Drums sounded through the night. Families gathered in circles, holding one another, searching for strength. Each vigil was both a memorial and a protest, a way of saying, we will not let them be forgotten. In these gatherings, pain became collective. One family's loss was everyone's loss. And with each new disappearance, the circle of grief widened. But even as families cried out, they felt the weight of silence from those who were supposed to protect them. Many mothers say they were told their daughters had probably run away, that they were partying, that they would come back eventually. But days turned to years, and the women did not come home. This lack of urgency only deepened the pain. It told families, in quiet but devastating ways, that their daughters' lives were worth less. And that silence hurt as much as the disappearances themselves. The grief was not confined to one family, one town, or even one province. The disappearances along the Highway of Tears became a shadow across Canada. Children grew up hearing warnings about the road. Young women carried fear into every journey. And for many Indigenous families, the disappearances felt like part of a much older wound, a history of violence, neglect, and loss stretching back generations. To understand the Highway of Tears is to understand more than just the missing. It is to understand the grief carried by communities already burdened by centuries of trauma. A trail of pain runs along the Highway of Tears. Families waiting, communities grieving, questions echoing in the silence. But soon, the voices of those who could not stay silent began to rise. Families demanded answers. Advocates demanded action. And the story of the missing women began to take on a louder, more public voice. In the next chapter, we follow the rise of the voices who refused to let the Highway of Tears remain hidden in the shadows. For years, the disappearances along the Highway of Tears were met with silence, from authorities, from the media, from the world. But silence has a breaking point, and when it broke, it gave rise to voices that would not be ignored. Families, Indigenous leaders, and communities began to stand together. They turned pain into protest, and their voices became the heartbeat of a movement. In the late 1980s and into the 1990s, vigils began to turn into marches. Families walked with posters, photographs, and banners, refusing to let their daughters' faces disappear from public memory. These weren't just acts of mourning. They were demands for action. Each step was a message to the government, to law enforcement, and to Canada itself. We are still here. We will not be silenced. In Indigenous culture, women are often seen as life-givers, as protectors of family and tradition. Along the Highway of Tears, many of those left behind were mothers. And it was mothers who rose up to become warriors. Some had lost one child. Others feared for the safety of the rest. Their grief became fuel, and their voices carried far beyond the small towns of British Columbia they wanted us to forget. But I will never stop saying her name. Every time I speak, I keep her alive alongside grieving families. Indigenous leaders began to speak with increasing urgency. They pointed not only to the disappearances, but to the deeper roots: poverty, lack of transportation, systemic racism, and a long history of broken trust between Indigenous people and Canadian institutions. They asked a question that was both simple and devastating. If these were non-Indigenous women, would the response have been the same by the late 1990s and early 2000s? The movement began to grow. Families organized annual walks along the highway, covering hundreds of kilometers to honor the missing. Media outlets slowly began to pay attention. Documentaries, newspaper features, and investigative reports started shining a light on what had long been ignored. And with each story, the The voices grew louder in 2006. Years of advocacy led to a historic gathering, the Highway of Tears Symposium in Prince George, British Columbia. Families, indigenous leaders, community members, and officials came together for 3 days to share stories, pain, and, most importantly, solutions. Out of that symposium came 33 recommendations, from improving public transportation along the highway to strengthening support for families and increasing police accountability. It was one of the first times the Highway of Tears was acknowledged not just as a local tragedy, but as a national crisis. The voices of the families and their allies were no longer contained to northern British Columbia. They began to echo across Canada. Protests were held in major cities. Indigenous organizations called for national inquiries. And slowly, the Highway of Tears became part of a larger conversation about missing and murdered Indigenous women across the country. The movement was growing. The silence was breaking. And for the first time, the world was beginning to listen. The families and leaders had raised their voices. They had laid out the truth. But still, the disappearances did not stop. In the next chapter, we will explore the role of law enforcement, the investigations that were started, and the ones that were never pursued. And we will ask the haunting question, why was justice so slow to come along the Highway of Tears? For decades, the families of the missing along the Highway of Tears pleaded for answers. But too often, their cries were met with silence, dismissal, or half-hearted investigations. The result was not just unsolved cases, but broken trust between Indigenous communities and the very institutions meant to protect them. From the earliest disappearances, investigations were slow, fragmented, and often dismissive. Families say officers told them their daughters had run away. Others were told the women were probably drinking or living a risky lifestyle. To the grieving parents, it felt like the cases were closed before they even began. Each time this happened, families lost a little more faith. And each time a new disappearance occurred, that mistrust grew heavier. The highway stretches more than 700 kilometers through isolated towns and remote wilderness. Multiple RCMP detachments covered different sections of it. This meant cases were often split between jurisdictions, with little coordination. A disappearance in one town might not be connected to a case just kilometers away. Leads were lost, patterns were missed, and predators moved freely across the vast landscape. By the 1990s, frustration turned into public outrage. Families accused police of not taking the cases seriously because most of the victims were Indigenous women. Why were missing persons reports ignored? Why did it take days, sometimes weeks, before searches were launched? Why did families, not officers, end up organizing searches along the highway? We went out there with flashlights and shovels while the police sat back. We were the ones searching the ditches, not them. As the pressure mounted, the RCMP launched task forces to review the cases. One of the most notable was Project EPANA, formed in 2005. Its goal: to investigate disappearances and murders of women along major highways in British Columbia, including Highway 16. At its peak, EPANA had over 50 officers and a budget of nearly $6 million a year. For a moment, families felt hope. At last, someone was listening. But hope faded quickly. By 2012, funding for EPANA was cut drastically, from millions to less than $1 million a year. The number of officers dropped to a fraction. Families saw this as another betrayal. Just when the investigation seemed to be making progress, resources disappeared. And once again, silence returned from many Indigenous families. The failures of law enforcement were not just about poor investigations. They were about something deeper, a history of systemic racism, colonial violence, and generations of being silenced. The Highway of Tears became more than a string of tragedies. It became a symbol of mistrust, of promises broken, of justice delayed. And every time another woman vanished, the question grew louder: who was accountable? The failures of law enforcement left families carrying the burden of justice themselves. But what was happening on the highway? Who was preying on these women? And how many predators were using the silence as cover? In the next chapter, we will look at the predators of the Highway of Tears and the chilling possibility that more than one killer was hunting in the shadows. When justice fails, predators thrive. For decades, the Highway of Tears was not only a stretch of road, it was a hunting ground, a place where women vanished into the shadows, where killers found both opportunity and cover. The chilling truth is this: the Highway of Tears was not the work of one man. It was the hunting ground of many. Why here? Why this road? The answers are both simple and devastating. The highway is long, isolated, and poorly lit. For many women, especially those without cars, jobs, or resources, hitchhiking was not a choice, but a necessity. Predators knew this. They knew women would be walking alone, waiting for rides, vulnerable in the middle of nowhere. And they struck with chilling precision. Over the years, police linked several cases along the highway to known serial killers. One of them was Bobby Jack Fowler, an American drifter with a history of violence. In 2012, DNA evidence tied Fowler to the 1974 murder of 16-year-old Colleen McMillan. Investigators believe he may have been responsible for more, but he died in prison in 2006 before he could be fully questioned. Another name, Cody Leijbokoff, one of Canada's youngest convicted serial killers. Arrested in 2010, he was found guilty of murdering 4 women, including 15-year-old Lorraine Leslie, whose body was discovered off a logging road connected to Highway 16. And then there was Garcia Manuel Apodaca, a violent offender suspected in multiple disappearances. His movements overlapped with the region, though charges never stuck. These names are known, but they may be only part of the story. Investigators, criminologists, and families have long feared what the evidence suggests. The Highway of Tears was not haunted by a single monster, but by many. Different methods, different timelines, different regions of the highway. Too many variables for one man alone. The terrifying conclusion? For decades, predators may have crisscrossed these roads, hidden by its vast isolation, their crimes blending into one another like shadows in the night. Think of the fear these women must have felt. A ride offered on a lonely stretch of road, a smile from a stranger, the hope of getting home faster, and then silence. For families, the horror is doubled, because while some killers have been named, countless others remain faceless. Their identities unknown, their crimes unpunished. Were there organized rings of traffickers operating in the region? Were truck drivers using the cover of long hauls to abduct women without notice? Or was it a darker truth still, that the highway itself, with its lack of surveillance, its deep forests, and its culture of silence, became a magnet for predators across Canada and beyond? The evidence suggests all of these may be true even today. With awareness higher and the movement for justice louder, the fear remains. Women in the communities surrounding Highway 16 still walk its roads, still take rides, still live under the shadow of what it has become. And the predators, those known, those unknown, those never caught, remain part of its story. The Highway of Tears is haunted by predators, but it is also haunted by something deeper. The questions of what fuels their violence, what allows it to continue, and what society chooses to ignore. In the next chapter, we step back from the hunters themselves to examine the deeper forces at play: poverty, isolation, and a long history of inequality that made Indigenous women especially vulnerable to becoming prey. This is Part 7, Predators in the Shadows. Every disappearance along the Highway of Tears is a story of violence. But behind that violence lies something larger. These women were not vulnerable by chance. They were made vulnerable by poverty, by isolation, by systemic inequality, and by a long history of being ignored. To understand the Highway of Tears, we must understand the roots of vulnerability that turned this road into a hunting ground. Many of the women who disappeared came from small Indigenous communities scattered across northern British Columbia. These towns were, and still are, isolated with few resources and fewer opportunities. For families without reliable income, owning a car was a luxury. That meant one thing: hitchhiking. For work, for school, for visiting friends. Hitchhiking was not recklessness. It was survival. Until very recently, there was no safe, affordable public transportation along Highway 16. For decades, families and leaders begged for bus routes. But requests were delayed, ignored, or underfunded. This meant women had little choice but to rely on strangers. Every time they accepted a ride, they risked becoming the next name on the long, tragic list we asked for buses. For safety nets, they told us it was too expensive. But how expensive is a life? But poverty and transport are only part of the story. At the heart of this crisis is a much deeper wound: systemic racism. For generations, Indigenous people in Canada were stripped of land, culture, and identity. Families were torn apart by residential schools. Communities were left in cycles of trauma, poverty, and mistrust. And when Indigenous women went missing, the same system that had failed their ancestors failed them too. Police dismissed cases. Media coverage was minimal. The silence was not accidental, it was systemic. Whose lives are considered valuable? Whose stories are told? And whose voices are silenced? Generational trauma also played a role. Many families along the Highway of Tears had already survived decades of displacement, abuse in residential schools, and systemic neglect. The disappearances added yet another layer to that trauma, creating cycles of grief that stretched across entire generations. We lost our language. We lost our children to the schools. And now, we lose our women to the highway poverty. Isolation, lack of transportation, systemic racism, generational trauma. Together, they created the perfect storm. A storm in which predators knew they could hunt with little fear of being caught. The Highway of Tears was not only built on asphalt and gravel. It was built on centuries of inequality, and that made Indigenous women the most vulnerable of all. But vulnerability is not destiny. Communities refused to accept it. Families began to rise against it. And slowly, voices across Canada began demanding change. In the next chapter, we explore how the Highway of Tears became a national conversation, and how, at last, the country was forced to face its darkest truths. For years, the disappearances along Highway 16 were whispered about only in northern British Columbia. Families grieved in silence. Communities held vigils, made posters, searched the woods themselves. But the rest of Canada looked away. That silence would not last forever. Through persistence, protest, and grief, the Highway of Tears would finally break into the national conversation. And when it did, Canadians could no longer ignore what was happening along their forgotten roads. The fight for recognition began not with politicians, not with police, but with the families themselves. For decades, parents and siblings knocked on doors, wrote letters, and pleaded for investigations. Many organized marches, vigils, and memorial walks. They refused to let their daughters and sisters vanish from memory. We will not stop until the country listens. Community groups formed alliances. Indigenous leaders traveled across provinces, connecting the Highway of Tears to a much larger crisis: the violence faced by Indigenous women across all of Canada. It was not just Highway 16. It was everywhere. The disappearances stretched from Vancouver's downtown east side to the prairies, from northern Ontario to the Atlantic coast. The Highway of Tears was becoming a symbol of injustice, of neglect, and of voices demanding to be heard. Slowly, the media began to take notice. In the early 2000s, national networks aired documentaries, feature reports, and front-page articles about the missing and murdered women of Highway 16. Journalists traveled to Prince George, Terrace, and Smithers to interview families. They showed the world the dirt roads, the long walks, the desperate need for safe transportation. The stories were heartbreaking, but they were also undeniable. Canadians could no longer look away. Public awareness rose. Students marched. Urban Canadians, who had never even heard of Highway 16, now spoke the words Highway of Tears with sorrow and anger. The issue grew beyond British Columbia. It became a national mirror, reflecting the inequalities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous lives in Canada. And that mirror was uncomfortable. Because to acknowledge the highway of tears was to acknowledge centuries of systemic neglect. By the mid-2000s, political pressure was mounting. Calls for a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women grew louder. Governments could no longer dismiss these voices as isolated or exaggerated. There were too many families, too many names, too many graves, and the highway of tears, once a lonely stretch of road, had become a rallying cry for justice across Canada. Names began to matter. Posters with faces, walls of memory, public recitations of every missing and murdered woman. Each name was a reminder. This is not a statistic. This is a life. And the more Canadians saw these names, the harder it became to ignore the truth. The Highway of Tears was no longer a mystery hidden in the North. It was a story carried into every living room, every newspaper, every corner of the country. The Highway of Tears had entered the national spotlight. But with attention came more questions. What had the police really done to solve these cases? Why had so many families been ignored for so long? And what would happen now that the entire country was watching? In the next chapter, we pull back the curtain on police investigations and uncover a trail of failures, neglect, and unanswered questions. This is Part 9, the National Spotlight. When families first reported their daughters missing, they believed the police would act. They believed an investigation would begin immediately, that search parties would be organized, and that every lead would be followed. But along the Highway of Tears, reality was far different. Again and again, families described the same response: delay, indifference, and dismissal. Investigations that started too late, clues that were overlooked, and a haunting pattern of cases that seemed to fall through the cracks. In case after case, police told families their daughters had probably run away, or that they would come back in a few days. For Indigenous women, this assumption became almost automatic. Leads went cold in the very first hours, the hours that matter most in a disappearance. Search parties were often not organized until it was far too late. When evidence did surface, it was not always handled with care. Witness statements went unrecorded. Items were misplaced. Crime scenes were sometimes left unsecured. In some cases, crucial tips from the public were ignored entirely. Families who brought forward information were dismissed or told their accounts weren't reliable. Every misstep meant another wall between the truth and justice. Critics say systemic racism shaped the way police handled these cases. When white women disappeared in Canadian cities, media headlines screamed. Search parties were immediate. Pressure mounted. But along Highway 16, Indigenous women vanished into silence. Police often labeled them as drifters, runaways, or addicts. That bias determined how seriously their cases were taken and how many predators continued to walk free. For families, the failures of police were devastating. They were forced to become investigators themselves. Parents searched forests. Siblings organized vigils to draw attention. Some hired private investigators, spending what little money they had. Imagine carrying the grief of a missing daughter and the burden of doing the very work you believe the authorities would do. The result was devastating. For every solved case, there were many more that went cold. Files gathered dust in drawers. Names faded from headlines. Predators knew this silence. They took advantage of it. And families were left with the cruelest of wounds. Not just loss, but uncertainty. What happened to their daughters? Why the system failed them so completely? And could these tragedies have been prevented? By the mid-2000s, anger was building. Communities accused police of neglect. Journalists asked hard questions. Politicians could no longer ignore the pattern of failure. The Highway of Tears was no longer just a local tragedy. It was a national scandal. But if the investigations failed, what about the evidence? What about the suspects who may still be out there? In the next chapter, we open the files and explore the tangled web of suspects, theories, and possible truths hiding in the shadows of the Highway of Tears. This is Part 10, the investigations, what went wrong. For decades, the Highway of Tears has carried more questions than answers. Women vanished, lives were shattered, and yet the predators responsible remained hidden. But there were suspects, some with names, others with faces, and still more who remain faceless, shadows drifting in and out of the forests along Highway 16. Who were they? Opportunistic killers? Long-haul truckers? Drifters? Or serial predators who stalked the highway, confident that no one was watching? One of the most persistent theories points to drifters, men passing through, often strangers to the communities along the highway. Truckers, loggers, or transit workers could easily pick up hitchhikers and vanish into the endless wilderness. With thousands of square miles of forest, rivers, and remote terrain, a body could be hidden and never found. The road itself became their cover. In 2012, police announced they had identified an American drifter named Bobby Jack Fowler as a suspect in several Highway of Tears cases. Fowler was a convicted criminal with a violent history against women. DNA evidence tied him to the death of at least one victim, Colleen McMillan, who disappeared in 1974. Investigators believe he may have been responsible for more, but Fowler died in prison in 2006, taking his secrets with him. Was he the monster families had long feared, or just one predator among many? Then came another shocking name, Cody Leijbokoff. In 2014, he was convicted of murdering 4 young women in northern British Columbia. At just 20 years old, he became one of Canada's youngest serial killers. Leijbokoff hunted online, lured women, and left their bodies in remote areas near Highway 16. His crimes raised terrifying questions. Had he been responsible for more? Could he be tied to the Highway of Tears cases? Police could not prove it, but the possibility still lingers. Beyond Fowler and Leijbokoff, investigators examined dozens of other suspects, violent offenders, drifters, and men with long criminal records. Some were cleared. Others were never fully investigated. The terrifying truth is that the Highway of Tears may not have one killer. It may have many. A series of hunters who, over decades, used the same road as their hunting ground for families. Knowing their suspects offers little comfort. Because while names have surfaced, justice is not. Some killers may already be dead. Others may still walk free. And every time another woman sets foot on that highway, the shadows feel alive again. The shadows hide suspects, but they also hide stories. Stories of women who vanished, each one with a name, a face, and a family who still waits. In the next chapter, we return to their lives, to the victims whose stories must be told, so that the shadows of the Highway of Tears are never allowed to erase them. When we speak of the Highway of Tears, we often speak of suspects, investigations, and failures. But at the heart of this tragedy are the women themselves. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends. They had dreams, laughter, and futures waiting for them. Ramona Wilson was just 16 years old when she disappeared in 1994. A high school student in Smithers, she loved volleyball, hanging out with friends, and was known for her kindness. On the night she vanished, Ramona had gone to meet friends. She never returned. Months later, her remains were found near the airport. For her family, the discovery ended the search, but not the grief. Decades later, her case remains unsolved. In 2002, Nicole Hoare, a 25-year-old tree planter from Alberta, went missing while hitchhiking near Prince George. Unlike many of the indigenous women who disappeared, Nicole was white. Her case gained national headlines almost immediately, sparking debates about why some disappearances were covered while others were overlooked. But despite the media attention, Nicole's body has never been found. Her family still waits. In 1990, 15-year-old Delphine Nicol disappeared while hitchhiking to a friend's house. Her disappearance devastated her community. She was described as bubbly, loving, and close to her siblings. Her family still holds vigils every year, keeping her memory alive. But after more than 3 decades, her case remains unsolved. Perhaps one of the youngest victims was 12-year-old Monica Jack. She was riding her bike near Merritt in 1978 when she disappeared. Her remains were not found until 17 years later. In 2019, a man was convicted of her murder. But justice came too late for Monica, who had her entire life ahead of her. And these are only a few of the names: Tamara Chipman, Alberta Williams, Gloria Moody, Virginia Samper. Each one represents a family broken, a life cut short, a story unfinished. To list every name would take hours, and still, it would never be enough. Because every woman lost along this road is more than a statistic. She is loved. She is remembered. She matters. For the families, telling these stories is both painful and necessary. They speak not only of grief, but of hope. The hope that someone, somewhere, still remembers. Every photo, every vigil, every poster is a fight against forgetting. These women are gone, but their voices remain. Their stories are the heartbeat of the Highway of Tears. In the next chapter, we return to the forests, rivers, and roadsides themselves, to the places where many of these women were last seen, and to the chilling geography that has become part of the mystery. Every story has a setting, and in the case of the Highway of Tears, the setting is as much a character as the people who lived and died along its edges. This is a land of beauty and danger. Endless forests, rushing rivers, mountains that rise like walls, and a highway that cuts through it all like a scar. For the families of the missing, the geography is not just background. It is part of the mystery, because here, the land itself can swallow secrets whole. Highway 16 runs nearly 450 miles from Prince George to Prince Rupert, winding through small towns, reserves, and long stretches of wilderness. Along this road, there are miles with no houses, no lights, and no cell service. At night, the darkness is absolute. For a young woman walking alone, visibility vanishes. For a predator in a passing car, opportunity appears. The forests here are vast and unforgiving. Towering evergreens block out the sky. Paths twist and vanish. For searchers, the woods can be a nightmare. Endless ground to cover, every tree hiding possibility. For those seeking to conceal a crime, the forest offers something else: cover, silence, and disappearance. It is said that once you step a mile into these trees, the highway might as well be a world away. Then there are the rivers, the Skeena, the Bulkley, the countless unnamed creeks that carve through the valleys. These waters are fast, cold, and deep. A body could be carried for miles, lost forever beneath the current. For families, rivers are symbols of both hope and despair, places where answers might lie, but where evidence is often washed away. Rest stops along Highway 16 were meant to offer safety for weary travelers. But for women alone, they could be places of danger. Dimly lit, far from help, strangers coming and going unnoticed. Many women were last seen near gas stations or rest stops, their final moments swallowed by the anonymity of a road filled with passing faces. Altogether, the geography of Highway 16 creates the perfect cover. A predator does not need to be clever when the land itself hides the evidence. Forests to conceal, rivers to erase, long stretches of silence where cries for help cannot be heard. The land is beautiful, but for those who vanished, it was merciless. And so, the highway itself begins to feel alive. To families, it is more than asphalt. It is a presence, a haunting shadow that looms over every memory, every unanswered question. Some say the road has swallowed the missing. Others believe it carries their voices, whispers in the wind, echoes in the trees, shadows in the headlights at night. Whether crime scene or curse ground, the Highway of Tears is never just a road. It is a reminder of danger, of loss, and of the mysteries still hidden beneath its silence. But geography alone does not tell the whole story. To understand the Highway of Tears, we must also understand the lives and struggles of those who walk its length. In the next chapter, we step into the lives of the indigenous communities who call this land home and explore how culture, history, and resilience intertwine with tragedy. To understand the Highway of Tears, we must understand the people who have lived beside it for generations. Along its length lie dozens of First Nations communities: Wet'suwet'en, Gigson, Carrier, and many others. For them, the road is not just a highway. It cuts through their ancestral lands, their hunting grounds, their stories, their lives. And it is their daughters, sisters, and mothers who have vanished most often into the silence of this place. For decades, Indigenous people in Canada faced systemic neglect and discrimination. Generations were scarred by the legacy of residential schools, forced assimilation, and poverty. When young Indigenous women began disappearing, their families raised the alarm. But police rarely listened. Complaints were brushed aside. Cases went cold quickly. Authorities often assumed the women had run away, ignoring the pleas of mothers who knew better. For many families, the silence of law enforcement echoed louder than the silence of the forests. In these communities, poverty runs deep. Many families cannot afford cars. Public transportation is scarce. And so, hitchhiking became a way of life, a dangerous necessity. Young women would walk miles along Highway 16, waiting for rides from strangers. Some made it safely home. Others never did. For predators, this was opportunity. For families, it was desperation. The road became a line that had to be crossed, even when danger lurked in every mile. But the story of the Highway of Tears is not only one of loss. It is also one of spirit. Indigenous families see the land as living. The forests, the rivers, the mountains, all carry voices. Elders say the missing women remain part of this land, their spirits whispering through the trees, their presence felt in the wind. For some, the road is haunted not just by grief, but by ancestors watching, demanding justice. For years, these voices were ignored. Families begged for action, for safe transportation, for serious investigations. But too often, their cries fell into the same silence that swallowed their daughters. It took decades and dozens of disappearances before the world finally began to listen. By then, the Highway of Tears was already a scar etched deep into Canada's conscience. But the Indigenous communities did not give up. They organized marches, vigils, and protests. They kept the memories of the missing alive with photographs, ceremonies, and the Red Dress campaign, a haunting reminder of the women who should still be here. Out of silence, they created sound. Out of grief, they built resilience. Out of loss, they demanded change. The Highway of Tears is a story of crime, yes, but it is also a story of community, of families who refuse to be erased, and of a people who turned their pain into power. In the next chapter, we step into the efforts that brought this tragedy into the national spotlight. The movements, the campaigns, and the relentless push for justice that forced Canada to finally pay attention. This is part 14, Voices of the Land. For decades, the disappearances along Highway 16 were met with silence. Families grieved, but their cries went unheard. Police reports gathered dust. The media paid little attention. But silence can only last so long. Out of grief came movement. Out of sorrow came fire. And soon, a symbol appeared, a red dress swaying in the wind. The Red Dress campaign began as an art installation by Metis artist Jamie Black. She hung empty red dresses in public spaces, each one a haunting reminder of an Indigenous woman who was missing or murdered. The dresses moved silently in the breeze, but they spoke louder than words. They represented lives stolen, family shattered, questions unanswered. And soon, the image spread. Communities across Canada and the world adopted the symbol. Streets, schools, and highways were lined with dresses, turning public spaces into living memorials. The dresses were only the beginning. Families began to organize vigils along Highway 16. They carried pictures of their missing daughters, candles glowing against the darkness. They marched in cities. They chanted outside government offices. Their grief became a movement. The world could no longer look away. The pressure grew too strong to ignore. In 2016, the Canadian government launched the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Families traveled long distances to testify. Mothers spoke of daughters who never came home. Sisters told of nights spent walking the highway, hoping for a glimpse of the missing. The stories were heartbreaking, but necessary. The inquiry declared what indigenous communities had always known, that these disappearances were not isolated crimes, but part of a systemic failure, a national tragedy, a human rights crisis. Awareness spread not only through politics, but through art and culture. Music was written in honor of the missing. Paintings and murals filled city walls. Plays and performances carried the message to wider audiences. Each act of creation turned pain into remembrance, and remembrance into resistance. The women were no longer invisible. Their presence filled the streets, the galleries, the air itself. The Red Dress campaign, the marches, the inquiries, all were built on one foundation: memory. Because memory is power. Memory keeps the missing alive in the hearts of those who love them. Memory refuses to let the world forget. And in that memory lies hope. Hope that one day the truth will be found and justice will follow. But even as awareness grew, the mystery remained. The campaign shone a light, yet so many questions were left in shadow. Who hunted along this road? Who watched as young women vanished? And why, after all the voices, all the vigils, all the red dresses, do so many families still wait for answers? In the next chapter, we turn from activism back to the darkness, and we look closely at the predators who may have stalked the highway of tears. Every mystery has two sides: the victims and those who preyed upon them. Along the highway of tears, somewhere in the shadows, predators were hunting. Some names we know, others remain faceless, hidden by the silence of the land. But one truth remains: the disappearances along Highway 16 were not accidents. They were acts of human cruelty. Over the years, investigators uncovered links between the Highway of Tears and several known killers. One name stands out: Cody Leijbokoff, a young man from Fort St. James, convicted in 2014 for the murders of 4 women. His crimes shocked Canada, not only for their brutality, but for how long he operated before being caught. There were others, serial predators whose movements overlapped with Highway 16, men already serving sentences for killings in other provinces. Each one raised chilling questions. Were they connected to the disappearances here? Or were there multiple predators, taking advantage of the same lonely road? But even beyond the known names, the highway whispers of others. Long-haul truck drivers who passed through late at night. Strangers who offered rides and were never seen again. Men who lived in nearby towns, unnoticed until rumors surfaced years later. Police files hint at suspects who were questioned but never charged. Local whispers tell of predators who slipped away before authorities looked too closely. The truth is chilling. This was not one killer. It was many, a pattern of opportunists taking advantage of isolation, poverty, and neglect. The geography of Highway 16 created the perfect hunting ground. Victims were often young, indigenous, and vulnerable, forced to hitchhike out of necessity. The road was long, empty, and dark. For decades, travelers have whispered of strange presences on this road. A hitchhiker who vanishes when approached. A silence so deep it feels alive. A darkness that seems to swallow those who walk too close. But behind the stories lies something more chilling: women disappearing without a trace. Is this a haunting born of grief, or the shadows of real predators hiding in a mist? As part 1 closes, the question remains: what secrets does the Highway of Tears still keep, and will it ever reveal them?